Our opening words today are titled Come Into the Circle of Community, Come Into the Sacred Space by Andrew Pakula. Come into this circle of community, come into the sacred space. Be not tentative, bring your whole self. Bring the joy that makes your heart sing. Bring your kindness and your compassion. Bring also your sorrow, your pain. Bring your brokenness and your disappointments. Spirit of love and mystery, help us to recognize the spark of the divine that resides within each of us. May we know the joy of wholeness. May we know the joy of being together.
With your mics muted, please join Sandy Hay in singing our opening hymn, Wake Now My Senses, by Thomas J.S. Mickelson and Carlton R. Young.
Wake now my senses and hear the earth call. Feel the deep power of being in all. Keep with the web of creation your vow. Giving, receiving, as love shows us how. Wake now my reason, reach out to the new. Join with each pilgrim who quests for the truth. Honor the beauty and wisdom of time. Suffer the limit and praise the sublime. Wake now compassion, give heed to the cry. Voices of suffering fill the wide sky. Take as your neighbor both stranger and friend, praying and striving their hardship to end. Wake now my conscience with justice thy guide. Join with all people whose rights are denied. Take not for granted a privileged place. God's love embraces the whole human race. Wake now my vision of ministry clear. Brighten my pathway with radiance here. Mingle my calling with all who will share. Work toward a planet transformed by our care. And now Maxine will share a story for all ages.
Thank you, Sandy. That was wonderful. Our story today is The Garden from Frog and Toad Together by Arnold Lobo. Frog and Toad Together. Frog was in his garden. Toad came walking by. "What a fine garden you have, Frog," he said. "Yes," said Frog, "it is very nice, but it was hard work." "I wish I had a garden," said Toad. "Well, here are some seeds. Plant them in the ground," said Frog, "and soon you will have a garden." "How soon?" asked Toad. "Quite soon," asked Frog. Toad ran home and he planted the seeds. "Now, seeds, start growing." Toad walked up and down a few times. The seeds did not start to grow. Toad put his head toward the ground and said loudly, "Now seeds start growing." Toad looked at the ground again. The seeds did not start to grow. Toad put his head very close to the ground and shouted, "Now seeds start growing." Frog came running up the path. "What is all this noise?" he asked. "My seeds will not grow," said Toad. "You are shouting too much," said Frog. "Those poor seeds are afraid to grow." "My seeds are afraid to grow?" asked Toad. "Of course," said Frog. "Leave them alone for a few days. Let the sun shine on them. Let the rain fall on them. Soon your seeds will start to grow." That night, Toad looked out his window. "Drat," said Toad. "My seeds have not started to grow. They must be afraid of the dark." Toad went out to his garden with some candles. "I will read the seeds a story," said Toad. "Then they will not be afraid." Toad read a long story to his seeds. All the next day, Toad sang songs to his seeds. And all the next day, Toad read poems to his seeds. And all the next day, Toad played music for his seeds. Toad looked at the ground. The seeds still did not start to grow. "What shall I do?" cried Toad. "These must be the most frightened seeds in the whole world." Then Toad felt very tired, and he fell asleep. "Toad, Toad, wake up," said Frog. "Look at your garden." Toad looked at his garden. Little green plants were coming up out of the ground. "At last," shouted Toad, "my seeds have stopped being afraid to grow." "Now you will have a nice garden too," said Frog. "Yes," said Toad, "but you were right, Frog. It was very hard work."
I invite you now to center yourselves and enter into a time of reflection, meditation, or prayer. Today's meditation is by Jeffrey A. Lockwood. Once upon a time, a thief snuck into the room of a sleeping Buddhist monk. As the burglar rummaged about, the monk awoke. The startled thief ran into the snowy streets with the monk racing after him. "Please stop," the monk called. And the man finally did, realizing that his pursuer was no threat. "You'll need this," the monk gasped, handing the thief his own coat. "What do you mean?" the man asked. "I saw that you dashed from my room into the cold without so much as a winter wrap, and I realized that I had both a woolen blanket and a coat." Having heard this implausible tale of sainthood years ago, I forgot the details, but remembered the essential events. Ordinary people can't be morally compelled to make such extraordinary sacrifices. But for whatever reason, perhaps the sheer absurdity of such an unconditional altruism, this parable stuck with me. It rattled around in my skeptical mind until the day my wife played the role of the Buddhist monk. Nan and I headed into the mountains for a day of skiing with our children, who were 4 and 6 at the time. In the chaos of packing up that morning, we'd forgotten our daughter's mittens. The wind was whipping and mercury hovered in the teens, so no mittens meant no skiing. But for Nan, the solution was as obvious as it was simple. She always wore 2 pairs of socks, so she removed the outer layer and pulled them over Aaron's hands. The problem solved, we headed down to the trail. I found her approach rather clever, the sort of practical motherly thinking that often eludes my mind, but hardly heroic. However, the bitter cold and the woolen warmth evoked the parable of the monk's coat. Among the snow-hushed pines, I remembered how the dialogue ended. "I don't understand," the man said. "It's simple. You have nothing at all to keep you warm," the monk answered. "But you are a fool to give away your coat, leaving you with only the blanket," the man replied, reaching for the garment. "If I had 2 gloves on one hand and none on the other, would I be a fool to put one of them on their hand?" the monk asked. The man said nothing, took the coat, and hurried down the street. When we are not alienated, when love draws us into the suffering of others, when we see our happiness entwined in their well-being, then generosity is neither foolish nor heroic. It is the simplest and most obvious choice. Let's share now in an interlude titled Beginnings, composed and played for us today by Melanie. Thank you, Melanie. That was beautiful. I started thinking about the ideas in this message in late April or early May while I was juggling in my living room, trying to stay sane while teaching 2 lecture courses and 2 lab courses online. When we made the move to online instruction in March, I definitely did not juggle. You might wonder what led me to be juggling in my living room. You might also wonder whether my efforts at preserving my sanity have in fact been completely wasted. And by the end of this message, we'll definitely know the answer to that first question. What led me to juggling is a little bit of a long story, but the key points are that when I was a kid, I had expressed a desire to learn to juggle, and my kind, wonderful mother bought me a set of juggling balls, which I proceeded to not use for about 25 years. I did, however, move them along with the rest of the contents of my desk all over the place, and yes, that's true, please don't judge me. So they were sitting on the desk when I was feeling totally discouraged and burnt out, trying to cope with the new work situation. A colleague who had already taught an online course would warn me. She said, when you go online, if you're not careful, you'll end up working 8 a.m. to midnight day after day until you go nuts. And I was well on my way. I needed to break up my workday, and the juggling balls were sitting there, so I started to try for maybe 10, 15 minutes in the morning, 10, 15 minutes in the afternoon. And I, of course, completely failed because I had no idea what I was doing. But that was okay. I just needed the break in the day to preserve my sanity, and taking that time helped. It also helped me to ask important questions, like if I can take 20 or 30 minutes for this, can't I take maybe some time in the morning for a run? How about taking some more time for dishes or laundry or cleaning the bathroom? It helped me to return to life in a sense. And eventually I also started to be able to juggle, although not well. And juggling is interesting because you need to really focus, but you also need to really, really not focus. And so as I was doing it, lots of stuff was kind of passing through my head. And one day, the juggling balls from my mom reminded me how much my parents had invested in me. Investments that really didn't look like investments the way we think of in our modern capitalist sense, but instead investments that looked like gifts. And every success I've had is grounded in the gifts that my parents have given me. And that's a truth, and it's also a privilege that I'll never, ever be able to pay back. And that line of thinking directed me to ask, what are the investments that we need to grow as individuals and as a collective society? I kept coming back to this idea of investment as gift. We can see it illustrated in the meditation. The monk gives the thief a gift of his coat, and we can treat this as a parable about generosity, which it certainly is. He draws on the justification that he and the thief are 2 hands on one person. The monk could have given the coat to anyone in need, though, a beggar in the street, and the 2 hands metaphor still works. Why a thief? Someone who is trying to do him harm. The fairly obvious interpretation is that the monk's gift is an investment in the thief's future, that he might become more than he is now, if nurtured. That is an investment in the monk's future as well, everyone's future. Of course, that line of reasoning also works for anyone, but the fact that it's a thief in the story makes the point more salient. It takes only a short step to take this parallel up to a societal level. In some overt, obvious ways, our society has become like the mad person who refuses to remove the second mitten from their hand and place it on the other. The second hand becomes painful, frostbitten, gangrenous, and eventually deadly. But still, as a collective, we persist in acts of insanity, some of us convinced that only when things have gotten to their absolute worst will the hand's tissue finally heal and resolve the problem. In that metaphor, the insanity is obvious. I was drawn to the reading because even I, who subscribe to a number of heterodox economic ideas clearly well into the domain of socialism, if not communism, found myself struck by the disconnect in my own mind between how our society behaves and where its interests lie. In the past, I would have described many of our society's socioeconomic and political actions as unkind, unwise, and misguided. Increasingly, though, I have to recognize them as foolishly self-destructive to the point of insanity. The problem is, of course, easier to recognize than the solution. In the meditation, it's very easy to switch a mitten onto another hand. The means of growing into a kinder, more equitable society are likely less obvious to us and will doubtless take more time and effort to achieve. Like Toad in our story, we often don't know exactly what is best for the seeds we want to grow. We may be tempted to give them things they may not really need, rather than to just be patient. And it's hard to argue against doing something, particularly if it's harmless at worst. In the end, Toad's seeds grow because he has provided soil and water, the necessary conditions for seeds to grow. His poetry, his violin, and his singing are At least if our garden here is any indicator, not required. It's tempting then to laugh at Toad for providing them. But we should be kinder, remembering that perhaps it's not really for the seeds that he does these things, though he may not realize it, but for himself. And that's okay. Certainly these actions represent a more psychologically healthy approach to the situation as compared to his earlier actions of yelling at the ground in frustration. His latter efforts are, we must agree, more constructive ways of managing his impatience and his anxiety. If we look from a particular angle, perhaps Toad can serve as a role model for some of us, balancing the necessary hard work of garden maintenance with constructive acts of self-care. It's a stretch to be sure, but maybe a worthwhile one if it helps lead us to a good place and a good practice. As we work through these times of pandemic and social change, I sometimes feel like Toad. I'm trying to grow seeds through my work as an educator and as a researcher, but I often feel like yelling at the ground and other things and other people, not naming names. It seems like so often our educational system and our scientific endeavors are built to put mittens on top of mittens while ignoring the beginnings of frostbite or late stages of gangrene. Our societal norms and expectations make it psychologically easy to simply just work all the time, even doing things that are unnecessary or unproductive, trusting that more will automatically become better. And if we're honest, we also do those things to keep busy. Our work culture really likes to keep busy. However, seeds grow at their own rate if we provide the necessary conditions. Yelling at them won't help. So once those necessary conditions are provided, perhaps it's okay, perhaps it's even good, to take a minute to play some violin in the garden, host a social media cooking show, or to even learn to juggle. These seemingly frivolous activities may serve as an investment in our long-term mental health that will bolster our ability to tend to other important work that we each must do. That perspective led me naturally to a question: are there things at a societal level that we might consider frivolous which nonetheless represent important long-term investments in our societal growth? I think the answer is obviously yes, and to consider that idea more might benefit us. One simple example is aesthetics. We're taught from a very young age that how a thing functions, its substance, is important. How a thing looks, its aesthetics, is less important, or at least should be. Nonetheless, we know that aesthetics inform people's framing and valuation of things. That knowledge might encourage us to ask about the aesthetics of public transportation, public schools, public housing. It might encourage us to ask about the aesthetics of our government buildings and our most prestigious public universities, and how the aesthetics of the latter differ from those of the former. Are the choices made about these aesthetics frivolous, or are they planting seeds for future users, for how future users will perceive and apprehend the structures and the institutions held within them? And of course, we know the answer to that. And we know that in some situations, deliberate care and extensive cost is put into those decisions. And in some cases, deliberate care and extensive cost cutting is put into the decisions. It's difficult to think about this without considering for whom the structures and institutions are built to serve. Of course, I chose that example because it's accessible and clearly illustrates a line of thinking. A good question for you to ask me now would be, do you have any other examples, perhaps more subtle, less obvious ones? I agree that's a really good question, and I invite you to consider it, and then we can talk about it over coffee hour. In fact, I think those examples are relatively easy to find by thinking about what is valued and devalued in various contexts, and asking why a particular thing is devalued and what we lose by devaluing it. In public services, aesthetics was the devalued construct, and we can explore in each case what we lose when we devalue it. Race and gender theorist Bell Hooks might call this adopting a critical perspective. And one important benefit of adopting that perspective is it readily leads us to a more accurate view of society that has devalued the lives, cultures, and histories of Black and Indigenous people. But that's just one of many hierarchies of value that we can see, and in that seeing, we're forced to reevaluate and hopefully revalue things that have been lost. Many of us, I think certainly myself, are inclined towards thinking about big changes a lot, what we might term societal reform. That's good, that's important. But I think it's also important to use the critical perspective to look for opportunities to make smaller scale societal changes, or I'll define societal as anything involving 2 or more people, although maybe it should be 1 or more people. When we make decisions about how we, say, run a scout group, whether or not to start a particular type of business, or who does the dishes and who does laundry, We can ask what is implicitly valued and what's implicitly devalued in the ways we're operating. What is lost as a result? The asking of the question may not lead us to the best solutions, but I think it's likely that it'll lead us to better solutions. Each of these decisions is an investment of our time for a future outcome. I'm optimistic that we have a lot of future, so it's worth our effort to consider very carefully what it is that will help us grow and develop in the ways that align with our values, lead us to lives that reflect those values. And there are big obvious things, but I invite you also to take a little time to consider the subtle, the non-obvious, and even the frivolous, all of which may have unexpected and helpful roles to play in our growth and our development.
Thank you, Chris. We affirm the work of this fellowship and its mission through our financial contributions. We continue to rely on you paying your pledges and providing what you would otherwise drop in the collection plate. While our in-person activities may be suspended, our staff continue working hard to provide the services we need. They and the bills still need to be paid. Please give as generously as you can, and may what you give bring you joy. Please take this time to write a check if you wish and mail it to the fellowship at 6220 Jefferson Avenue, Midland, Michigan, 48640. To donate online, please stay after the service for instructions. Another option is to set up bank autopay, which can be arranged by asking our treasurer, Vicki, for the UUFOM checking account number, and then have your bank set up a regular payment for your account, from your account. Thank you for your generosity. Now let's share in an offertory interlude titled Theme from Liszt Concerto No. 1, played for us today by Melanie. Thank you, Melanie. Now, with your mics muted, please join Sandy in singing our closing hymn, We'll Build a Land by Barbara Zanotti and Carolyn McDade. Thank you, Sandy and Melanie. Our closing words today are by John C. Morgan. In the end, it won't matter how much we have, but how generously we have given. It won't matter how much we know, but rather how well we live. And it won't matter how much we believe, but how deeply we love.
Please join us in reading Our Chalice Extinguishing by Maddie Safantas, with your mics muted. We extinguish this flame, but we keep its light in our hearts, with its message of love and justice, taking it outside these walls to the world we live in until we are together again. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to everyone who helped make this service possible, and thank you all for joining us today. If you can stay to chat, great. If you need to go, we understand. Whatever you may encounter in the coming week, please know that the love of this community goes with you until we are together again. Many blessings.